We must blah blah the blah in order to blah the blah from the blah. Welcome everyone to another Mere Mortals Book Review podcast. This is the podcast where I, Kyron, as you might surmise, talk shit about politics, about economics, and about culture. No, I don't do that. But I will be talking a little bit about the book of today, which is the 1938 book from Stuart Chase called The Tyranny of Words. I read this on my Kindle, so I believe it said it had 420 pages. It took me a fair bit of reading to go through. I'm going to say 12 to 13 hours, something like that. It was a long, drawn-out period over a month or two. Now, this book is his attempt at furthering the field of semantics to the general public, and we'll be talking about what is semantics very shortly. So essentially, it's about language and the meaning behind language. So he takes us through the general theory, how language is used to compare to cats or primitive people, and the different ways that we use language to derive meaning. And then also areas of human conversation that contain more precise meaning, and plenty of examples of very unclear language where people were essentially, what I was saying, talking shit. So it's split into 19 chapters, and it's worth noting he was writing this in a time of pretty great upheaval. 1938 was when it was published, so just before World War I, and he had quite a few examples of people like Adolf Hitler, of Mussolini, of what is fascism, what is communism, capitalism. These were all hot topics that were being argued very fiercely in the lead up to this book, and he was kind of showing, a lot of what is being talked about is not helpful, and in fact is very unhelpful in the field of language, of discourse, and what is actually happening. So let's jump onto the first theme, and I suppose of understanding what is semantics. And it's really the study of linguistic meaning. Why words evoke certain meaning, and how they interplay or can convey information of something of deeper substance. So on your screen right now, you'll see something called the semiotic triangle, also known as the triangle of reference. And in the bottom left-hand corner, so the left-hand side of the pyramid, we've got symbol at the very top is thought or reference, and then the very right-hand side, the very right bottom, is the referent. And so these essentially stand for different things. The symbol stands for language, or the actual symbols that we can see. So if I say a word, or if I read a word, that is the symbol of what I'm talking about, so a piece of language. We have the thought or reference, so this is the actual language user. So the symbol symbolizes is a casual relation to the thought that evokes in your mind, and I'll give an example of this soon. And then the referent is the world or real life example. So the thing that happens in the human brain is the symbol stands for the referent, but must always be mediated by a human, because that's what language is used for. So language, although we might try and link it directly to an object as best as possible, I have a set of keys ahead of me right now. If I say keys, you'd think, oh, it just means this. But no, it actually has to go from language, something talking, through the human brain, or a comprehensive machine, and then it is trying to refer to the actual keys itself. So let's see how this can actually go wrong. Let's take the word apple. If I say, I like apple, that goes to your brain. You conjure an image, a thought that corresponds to a real-world matter and concept. Pretty easy, right? We're done. That's, it's sorted. I like apple. It couldn't be more clearer. Well, actually, it could be a lot more clearer, because you might think of an edible apple. You might think of the shape of an apple. You might think of the company Apple, and Apple laptop perhaps. You might be a chef, and you might even think, oh, I like apple. I like the taste of apple. So when I say I like apple, I is pretty easy, refers to me. Like is also understandable in this context, in that it's something that is pleasurable to me. I want it, or I desire it. But apple, it's a bit squeezy, and we could also do this with some other words if we really wanted to. With I and like, it's like, who is I? In this case, it's obvious. It's me, Kyron. But if this was just written down somewhere on a wall in graffiti, we wouldn't know who the I is either. So whereas if I say something like the apple hanging from the tree in my backyard, that's a lot more semantically clear. We realize, okay, it's an apple, it's hanging from a tree, so it's going to refer to a an apple that grows from a tree. But once again, we're pretty clear on what it means, but it's a sliding scale, because what if I have two backyards? Or what if there are multiple apples? What if I hung my Apple laptop in the tree in the backyard? There's all these different ways where we can go, okay, well, perhaps it's not the most precise, but there is certainly language which is more precise. And he's got so many examples of this. And he has a nice demonstration of just how unclear language can get by asking Volunteer what a fascist is. So once again, remember, this was in the period of the 1930s. So fascism was a big rising cultural issue at the time. And the responses vary hugely, making the use of this word difficult. So he had just examples from retail assistants, from professionals, from politicians, from housewives, from all sorts of people, and most of these were in America, but some of them were immigrants as well. And there was, when just asked the simple question, what is a fascist, some people were saying like it's the black shirt, some people were saying it's Mussolini, some people it's people who hate other people, some people it's for people who love authority. And so it just made any use of this word kind of redundant, because everyone had this different thing of what they thought it meant. So that's just one word. Magnify this with a sentence like something like, the threat of fascism to our democracy and the preservation of our spirit, our ideals, and our way of life requires a united stand of the American people. This would be the kind of jargon that you would hear from politicians or from certain people. And this could essentially be translated. So remember, we had the word fascism, but if we want to have ideals, spirit, American people, the united stand, it essentially translates to the threat of our blah to our blah, and the preservation of our blah and our blah blah requires a blah blah of the blah people. Nothing of worth was said because everything was too vague. It was too unclear. And once again, there's always going to be nitpicking. You can always go, okay, this person said this, and if you really want to get down to the philosophical details, what is I, what is like, what is apple, or what is the backyard, what does backyard mean? There's no need to go too far, but it's certainly worth looking at language and seeing, okay, a lot of things that a lot of people say is just garbage and rubbish and really has no meaning. So what are my takeaways from this book? Well, some areas of language and conversation are more fraught with unclear meaning, and this is why I mentioned right at the start, economics, politics, cultural, social issues, abstract philosophy are on one side of the spectrum of the sliding scale, on the unclear side of things. And then things like mathematics, scientific experiment, and particular honed in examples of someone talking about an issue that is very pertinent to them, that they have studied perhaps their whole life, that's more likely to be on the clearer side of things. And it's not worth paying much attention to the former, which is actually what I do a lot with my life. I really despise politics, and I've been trying to learn about economics, and my brain is it's honing in on the idea that there's not much of worth being said by a lot of people. Some other things, abstraction is fine, and this is where he says abstraction in the book is unhelpful, because when you're abstracting things and using a concept, it's like a concept on a concept sort of deal. It's okay to kind of do this as long as you know that you're doing it, and as long as you know the person saying the words is doing it, and then as long as the people who are interpreting your words also know that abstraction is fine. But that doesn't happen a lot. So poetry, for example, is unclear, but intentionally so. A lot of abstraction goes on with poetry, but nobody makes claims upon reality based on the writings of Edgar Allan Poe, for example. So, and using it to take real world action or to derive, you can still derive meaning from it, but the meaning is intentionally meant to be different. And I've found this with a lot of philosophy, for example, which is kind of made me disillusioned with a lot of philosophy. Was I thought these people were trying to get at the heart of base reality, but I think in the end they were just putting their spin on it, and they were saying a lot of things which could be interpreted in a myriad of ways. So it's not really a philosophical grounding of what is the universe and what is real life. It's more, okay, this is some fun poetry. that I've created, but I'm not going to call it poetry because I'm way too intellectual for that. That's kind of my impression of a lot of philosophy. If you want to critique or praise something, it's worth getting to the minutiae, the most fundamental aspect. Clarifying terms and definitions also very helps immensely with this. This is something that we've done on the Mere Mortals podcast a lot of times, where if we had a topic that we're discussing, we would usually start with the definition, because that would clear up just any confusion between myself and my co-host Juan, and then also the audience at home. So that if we said, okay, we're going to be discussing this week, calisthenics. Well, what actually is calisthenics? Okay, because some people can have very different ideas of simple fundamental words like what is fascism. The last one I took was, you'll never be perfect with this. It's almost impossible, I think, by the definition of language, and people have tried to dive deepest into this and really get to the heart of, okay, how is a language constructed? Is it possible to have certain clear things? And with language, you actually can't really. Mathematics is a much more sound discipline in terms of this refers to this and this stands for this, and if you have this order of symbols, we're all clear on what this means, and it's indisputable. 2 + 2 = 4. That is always going to happen. Read a book like 1984, George Orwell. 2 + 2 can equal 5 in this language, and it's this idea that language can be molded, can be used in various different ways, and a lot of language just straight up doesn't derive your meaning, which is fine. You don't have to have meaning from everything. If you want to read poetry, if you want to hear silly stuff, if you want to read philosophy and it's poetic philosophy, that's fine. Just understand that the meaning you might derive from that is not the same. So you can have people reading different things, hearing different things, and they can be reading and hearing the same thing but deriving different meanings from that, which can end up causing a lot of strife and a lot of anger issues, things like that. We won't get too into that, but it's definitely worth noting that it's very hard to do. And even on some of the Mere Mortals episodes, there's episodes where I look back and I go, that was semantically unclear. That conversation we just had, the meaning that I derived from it, that probably people from home derive from it, is questionable at best, and I even question whether those episodes were worth doing because the abstractions were getting too large. The ideas, the language we were using was fuzzy in my own mind, and if it's fuzzy in my own mind, how is it going to be clear to anyone else? So let's jump on to the author himself, Stuart Chase. Well, he wrote a few books related to quite a few different topics, actually. Consumer protection, advertising, politics, science. It's actually kind of fun going through his biography and seeing that he wrote about a lot of things which were semantically unclear. Politics, economics, science, so many of these sciences is better, I suppose, but the condemnation that he had was for people speaking on these topics. The examples he had is likely how he also did. I really do need to read some of his other books and see how semantically clear he was. So this could be a little bit of hypocrisy going on here. This was written towards the later end of his life. So perhaps this was after years of fighting in the trenches. He had an awakening of going, man, I spent a lot of time focusing on things which really didn't matter. Once again, just because you have an idea that perhaps is outside of the norm or something different, or that you believe in certain things of the right to free speech, perhaps you believe in you're pro-life, perhaps whatever, it doesn't really matter what you believe in. It's worth just considering how you are communicating these ideas and how these ideas are getting communicated to you, because you might believe in a certain thing. You might believe I'm communist because I want the world to be a better place and this is the best way to do it. But then you look at the history of suffering, of poverty, of what these systems have done to people, and it's not just communism, fascism, chuck it in there. Any sort of authoritarianism generally ends up in pretty bad scenarios for the people of that country. It's worth going, okay, just because this is being communicated as a good thing, it's worth seeing the language and okay, how are they actually going to do this? What do they mean when they say a lot of these things? And if you look behind a lot of the words and really try and get to the heart of the meaning, you can see, there's actually a lot of anger in this, and we saw this in the Law by Frederick Bastiat in the previous episode. The reason I love this book, extra details, is that he really captured my observations perfectly in many different regards. I have a long time struggled to really understand what is it about politics that I dislike. I used to think it was because of the strife and what I saw as needless contention that seemed to pop up, of people talking over each other, past each other. Just listen to any political debate, and it's just some of the most ineffective forms of communication I've ever seen. And I thought it was actual the friction and the conflict that was being caused. And I don't like conflict. It's not something I find immensely satisfying to watch, or fights and things like that. But I actually think it could just be that I've recognized just how unclear and devoid of meaning a lot of this is. Reading philosophy, for example, has been a largely frivolous pursuit with some pretty passages, but lacking in meaning. And I thought philosophy was meant to get to the heart of the matter and derive meaning in a substantial, indisputable way. But it's not. It's a lot of it is people talking back and forth. You read some niche, he's talking shit about the other philosophers. You read any other philosopher. I just tried a William James book on pragmatism, and the first chapter he just was talking about empiricists and realism, and it was so unclear. It's just so unclear. Economics, for example, is a word salad with no clear rules of why A affects B, or consistent answers to simple questions like, what is inflation? Why does it occur? Certain topics are just so fraught with varied meanings that even if the communication doesn't devolve into anger, polemics, and conflict and strife, nobody comes away with more clarification on what the speaker means. And in his introduction to the book, throughout the book, he nailed this home for me. He hammered this home. Holy crap, there is so much language which is unclear. Mine as well, but it's not as bad as a lot of politics, as a lot of economics, as a lot of philosophy. So jumping on to my summary here. This book is fantastic. I loved it. There were a couple of moments where I felt my mind slipping in terms of what he was talking about. Perhaps he was hammering home a point. Semantics is rather dry. The introduction, there's passages. It's when he really was highlighting examples, particularly when he was doing those things like this sentence can be translated as the blah from the blah, 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 blah. Those were where I just went, it was light bulb moments for me. I really saw what he was getting at, what he was talking about. So I could see 9 out of 10 people disliking this book, honestly, because of the dry topic. And perhaps you feel like he's not adding anything of note, of just saying, this is what language is, look how unclear it is. And, even that slight bit of hypocrisy, he mentions it in the book, that writing a book on semantics, you could pick the book apart and say, what does this word mean? What are you trying to say here? This isn't clear. And I think he captured that paradoxical situation of, okay, I'm trying to clear up my own language or explain why language is unclear in language, so I'm doomed no matter what. And but for me, I can see why people wouldn't like this, but for me, he explained clearly a lot of the problems I see with communication and why I tend to avoid certain discussions and certain topics. And it was refreshing for me to have a kind of an answer as to why I dislike certain things and not feel bad about not being interested in them, because why waste my time on something which has no meaning? And that's what a lot of life is about, is trying to find meaning in life. So inspirational for me to stick to the principles of clear semantics. I've taken many things from this book where I want to not only listen and look out for things and podcasts of language that people use and see, okay, is this person talking shit right now, or is there some actual meaning behind their words? And also try and do it for myself. It's going to be extremely hard. I'm an imperfect mere mortal. I'm never going to be able to do this perfectly, but I think I can clear up my language, and that'll make it better for me. It'll make it better for you as the listener, the book listener at home. So 9 out of 10 people would perhaps dislike this book, but for me personally, this book was a 9 out of 10. And that's a rare rating for me. I very, very rarely give books that high a rating. So The Tyranny of Words by Stuart Chase, worth checking out if you want to just see how silly language can get. It's not really like any book I've read before. If you want an example of some unclear meanings in books, try the book Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last French name there. So that book was extremely hard to read, needlessly so. It has some meaning in it, and it inspired the Matrix, the movie, which was a fantastic genre-breaking movie in many respects. Yet that book was very hard to read, and a lot of postmodernism books are like this, and this was a great example of that semantically unclear language. But I would also say try reading a book by Heidegger, try reading some philosophy, try reading some niche, and try reading political and economical books just in general. You're probably going to have a good chance of that being semantically unclear and not deriving much meaning from it. So those were anti-book reviews recommendations right there. So just keep an eye out on that. All right, well, getting into our end sections here. So this is a value for value podcast. I don't have any ads. I don't have any sponsors. I don't have any form of financial backing here. And so I ask for you, the listeners at home, to provide some value back to me, because I do this all free up front, and it will always be free and upfront. How could you do this? Well, you could share this book review with someone that you think would enjoy this, of a friend perhaps, doing it by word of mouth, sharing it via any social media and links and things like that is much appreciated. You can also comment on this video. I also do these as audio as well, so in podcasting apps. You could give me some book recommendations. I would love to know books based on my rating system, or based on how I feel about these things. If you have one that, if you've read this book, thought it was amazing as well, I would also love to know what books you find amazing. That would be extremely valuable to me. And then you can finally do this with a bit of money as well if you want to help support the podcast in terms of hosting costs and things like this. We have a PayPal link down below, and if you go to meremortalspodcast.com/support, we've got a couple of other different ways where you can help to support the show financially there. And I will always call those out and for people who have done that, and give you a big shout out on the channel itself. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. I do these live. I will have a note that likely next week there's going to be a gap. I'm traveling back to Brazil. Juan won't have a book review ready by then. The week afterwards, I'm going to be in the middle of nowhere. I don't know if I'll have internet connection. I probably will. Unlikely that I'll get a book review done, so there might be a 2-week gap, just depending on if Juan can get one out or not. But then I do hope to be back into somewhat of a normal routine in terms of doing these regularly. I'm going to be traveling for a fair while, so the book reviews, they'll still come out weekly, ideally, but timing-wise, all those sorts of things, just keep an eye out, because it might slightly change. So that's it. Very much appreciate everyone for tuning in. I really hope you got some meaning from this. Hope you derived something from my semantically clearer words. And until the next time, ciao for now. Kyron out.